of it. A great story I love telling, and this is a story that, what's his name? The educator, Kenneth, it's just escaped me. But anyway, he tells the story of, in the 1700s, Dr. Michael Faraday at the University of London. He was one of the first to invent ways to harness electricity. And he was doing these spectacular electricity shows on the science stage in front of a theater of other scientists at the university. And, and it was just mind-boggling for all of them to watch this. But at the end of the show, they said, well, Dr. Faraday, this is all very fascinating, but what is any of this good for? They could not yet see the practical uses for electricity. I think a lot of these fourth industrial revolution technologies like artificial intelligence, like blockchain technologies, I think we're still at a point where a lot of us are trying to figure out, what is this good for? What are the practical uses for it? This COVID crisis, because it has disrupted business as normal for so many industries, I think is going to nudge us in the right direction. That will have some implications for the labor market, especially when we look at certain technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning. I think it could accelerate, in fact, some of that job displacement in some of those kind of more routine, predictable task jobs, jobs maybe in the food and accommodation sector, jobs perhaps in the retail sector, as companies start to embrace and understand in a better way how these cyber technologies are able to transform and help their businesses. So that's the first reason I'm optimistic, is because it will accelerate our economic embrace of these cyber technologies, this fourth industrial revolution. That ultimately will produce some productivity gains. It is going to alter probably what we think of when we think of typical employees, but it will also open up a lot of new areas of employment, jobs that don't even exist yet. So the the COVID crisis, I think, is going to accelerate our embrace of cyber technologies. That's the first reason. The second reason I'm excited about a post-COVID world is that it is going to reinvigorate for Canadians the importance of community. And what do I mean by that? Community is one of those, for different people, that word will mean different things. Some of us will think of the neighborhood in which we live, and that certainly often forms a community. It might be a business community. It might be a faith community, maybe a sports community. Anytime human beings come together and they have some common interests and some common goals, you have at least the potential for forming community. And community, I think, has been a bit of the forgotten hero when we think about our modern economy. A great book that I've been reading, and if you need some good COVID day reading, if you got a lot of time on your hands, the book is called The Third Pillar: How Markets and the State Leave the Community Behind. This was written in 2019, or it came out in 2019, so pre-COVID. It was written by an economist by the name of Raghuram Rajan. He used to be the head of the IMF. He currently is an economics professor at the University of Chicago. But it's a great book, and it talks about how in the 20th century, our modern economy was first dominated by government. After the Second World War, the state became very, very heavily involved in economic direction, both here in North America, but also in Europe, as after the Second World War, Europe was being rebuilt, a lot of government programs, the 1950s, 1960s in the US. This was the era where the US was galloping ahead because of things like state education, things like regulation of industries, things like heavy investment in universities. So government was heavily involved in directing the economy throughout the post-Second World War, those 3 decades between the late 1940s and the mid-1970s. But by the 1970s, government involvement had become almost so dominant that it was crushing entrepreneurial spirit. It was crushing businesses. Things were becoming too heavily regulated. And as a result, global economies started to grind down. It was the era of stagflation, with very, very weak productivity, weak economic growth, and high inflation. That then heralded in the era of the free market. So this was the era of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and trickle-down economics and liberating the market and cutting regulations. That then heralded in a whole new decade or two of economic growth. The 1990s and early 2000s, we saw spectacular growth. In fact, the decade of the 1990s was the single longest unbroken period of economic expansion that the US had ever seen. So there we saw the first pillar, government, being overtaken by the second pillar, which was the free market and capitalism. But by the early 2000s and certainly into the 2010s, we started to see how the free market was enriching a lot of countries and enriching a lot of people, but it was not enriching everybody. And we were starting to see a split, a divergence of income and opportunity. We saw a lot of people, especially in the United States, being left behind by globalism, by free trade. It was not good for everybody. And as a result of that, we started to see some problems arising in the last 10 years or so. The rise of nationalism, the rise of populism, all of these things that a lot of them have their roots in the fact that not everybody in the United States or the United Kingdom or Brazil or Canada, for that matter, not everyone was doing well in a global liberalized economy. So the cracks in that pillar of the free market capitalism started to show up. This book talks about how you need all three pillars. You need government, you need capitalism and the market, but you also need a third pillar called community. And when all three of them are in balance and no single one of them becomes too dominant, that is actually where you want your economy moving towards and your society moving towards. So he talks about the importance of rediscovering and reinvigorating community. I think this COVID crisis is going to spark that. I don't know for sure. I'm not a sociologist, but my guess is as we move through this really troubling period, these are dark days for a lot of Canadians. There's a lot of anxiety. I think it's forcing people to really re-examine what is important to them, who they love, that they may or may not be able to be around right now, their community members, their friends, their family members, their coworkers. I think we will, in a way, reinvigorate or maybe rediscover the importance of community. And my hope is, coming out of this crisis, that stronger communities, stronger human connections, stronger economic connections with our friends and neighbors, that will then start to help balance out that free market, liberalized world of unfettered capitalism, and also balance off government. So you have all three of those pillars working together. The implications, I think, for the labor market and for employees and employers is that I think employers need to understand and embrace how community can actually be a real asset. All what of that means, I'm not entirely sure yet, but I think maybe employers might in the future, they might need to be more flexible with their employees' work arrangements. Some of those employees may want to take more time to be giving care for aging parents, for example. That, I think, is an example of how community might manifest itself in the post-COVID era, and being more flexible and more accommodating for employees to things like caring for aging parents, caring for their neighbors. All of that, I think, has implications for how workers in the future will balance both their work life, their personal life, but also their community engagement. And the final area, or the final reason why I'm excited, I think this pandemic is going to stimulate two things that I've always been a big fan of: creativity and innovation. I wrote a book back in released in 2012 called The Boiling Frog Dilemma. And a lot of it was around reinvigorating creative and innovative thought processes. And, I'm not the first economist that has identified creativity and innovation as important economic ingredients. So, that's not unique to me. But I do think this COVID crisis is stimulating creativity that we might not have had before if we were not, in fact, forced to rethink how a lot of these businesses are going to operate. I'm even looking at a lot of the businesses here in Calgary that suddenly, very suddenly, everything they thought they knew about their business plan is gone. How do you pivot? That is not an easy question. It's easier to say, oh, you have to pivot. How do you pivot? This is where creative and innovative thought processes are more important than they've ever been before. And I've seen some really creative ways that some businesses, across the country have been able to pivot. I think the successful ones, it's not to say they're not going to come out without some bumps and bruises, but I think the successful ones will come out the other end with creative and innovative ideas, being able to pivot their business plan. Here, I think there are lots of implications for the future of work. Even, think of all of us, most of us anyway, how we've been able to pivot, being creative and innovative with the technology we have available, to be able to work from home or work remotely. Maybe some of you worked from home already. Some of you might be fed up with working at home. You can't wait to get back to an office. But my guess is that through this COVID crisis, it might stimulate some different thought processes about how and when work gets done. This has already been ongoing for the last decade or more. But, it really is throwing this model of Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, Dolly Parton's whole song about how everyone hated working 9 to 5. I think more solidly that work model gets left now in the museum of the 20th century. And this COVID crisis forcing people to find new ways to work, where they work and when they work. I think it is going to liberate creative and innovative thought processes that I think will actually be beneficial. Not everyone is productive and creative and innovative between the hours of 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. on Monday to Friday. Some of us, our wave of inspiration might come on a Tuesday night, or it might come on a Sunday afternoon. It may not happen on a Tuesday morning. But giving employees the ability to work when and where and how it works best for them, I think this COVID crisis might reinvigorate that reality for a lot of people. I know, depending on the company, but I know some companies, they've been reluctant to allow people to work from home because there's a sense that people need to be supervised, that a manager needs to be walking up and down the hallways of the cubicle farms, heads down in your computer, everyone's working. Well, they might be looking at a computer monitor, but are they really being productive? That's a really great question that I know HR professionals have been dealing with. I think now, employers and supervisors have been forced to liberate their workers. They're working from home. They've had to let go of this control where they're supervising the cubicle farm. They have to trust their employees. Are they getting work done? They might not be getting it all done 9 to 5, but I think most employees, the good ones, will find ways that work for them to get work done remotely and on maybe a different time schedule. That, I think, will bring in creative and innovative ideas for employers going forward with liberating workers and giving them more flexibility to work when and where and how it makes most sense for them. And that, I think, is also a good thing. So those are 3 reasons why I am excited about what this post-COVID, when it arrives, we don't know, a year from now. But when we come out of this COVID crisis, the economy that emerges, the Canadian economy that emerges, I think we do have reasons, if we're smart about it, reasons to be excited, because I do think we are, finally being forced to leave some old models behind and forced to take on some new ways of thinking, adapting to new technologies, embracing communities, and being forced to be more creative and innovative thinkers. So, That's it for my presentation. So we've got lots of time. And I don't know, Deborah, are you going to moderate some of the Q&A, or do people want to just speak up, or
Yeah,
what do you want to do?
I'm going to moderate it. So I'll remind everybody that put your questions in the chat, and we'll just take them in order. So can I start with Ingrid, who has a question for you, Todd?
Great.
Hi, Todd. Great points. So here's the challenge. How do we as HR leaders help companies and managers understand the onset of the fourth revolution? Because yeah, a lot of employees want to go back to work. There's a lot of talk about employers saying you need to come back to work under the previous norms. So how can we as HR people help the leaders get there?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, and I suppose it would vary between companies and the relationships that the HR departments have with, the senior leaders, or if the HR leaders are themselves some of the senior leaders. And it might depend on the nature of the business exactly. So a lot of companies where their workers are more kind of thought and idea people, who maybe are working on a laptop, maybe working from home. I think human HR leaders might have some influence in being able to, break down some of those rules around when you need to be working. And I think a lot of companies have already kind of moved away from that. But I think HR leaders can go a long way in helping the senior management teams understand workers need to work when and where it works best for them. Let's give them the tools to do it. Let's trust them that they can get their work done when it makes sense for them. But if they need to take their mother to an eye appointment on a Thursday afternoon, that's part of living in community. That's part of work-life balance. But let's liberate them to do that. So maybe it's about instilling in senior management levels, we need to be able to trust our employees.
Okay. How do you think that's going to accelerate the gig economy that was out there? Because what the government is finding with the business dollars that they're putting out there, a lot of small employers were not qualifying because they didn't have payrolls. They're actually quietly been using that gig economy, which probably is going to accelerate into the larger companies, and then again affect HR leaders with how we structure hiring people. Sorry, Deborah, that was a second question.
No, it's also a really great question. And the gig economy is something I've been interested in for years. Coming out of the COVID crisis, I would expect the gig economy to probably accelerate. And I don't know the implications with the government programs. I know they're not ideally situated or ideally designed. I think this might be also the opportunity to initiate a whole new conversation about social income and employment support. I think it's the opportunity to talk about a universal basic income of some form, or how do we rethink some of those old-fashioned ways of supporting workers and supporting families. I mean, the EI program, for example, this is from the 1950s. Is it really the most appropriate model for the 21st century? Maybe it is, but my guess is we could probably, if we really thought about it, come up with something that makes more sense and something that recognizes the gig economy is real. In 1950, there was no gig economy, right? But there is today. So how do we rethink our system of social income support and employee income support as well?
Thank you. That was great. Thanks, Deborah.
I want to combine Galaxy A70, I don't know your name, to combine your question with Anne's question. So Galaxy, can you ask a question?
I like that name though, Galaxy A70.
I know.
Like we're living in the Borg or something, I don't know.
So if you want to ask your question, because Anne's asking about how we're going to define productivity, and Galaxy, you have a different take on it. Oh, there you are. You're muted still. Galaxy, you're muted. Okay.
Yeah, I think now you can hear. It's Ritesh.
Yes.
Hi. Thank you for the nice session. I have a question that how now in this situation we are going to measure the productivity and efficiency of the workers since they are working from home, just like I'm working from home. So a question for the management, like how they can like measure the productivity and efficiency of the workers, considering the KPI and the percentage of
Yeah.
things that employees need to do.
That is a fantastic question, and probably one I'm unqualified to answer, because depending on the nature of work, how you measure productivity is vastly different. So obviously, if you're working in a manufacturing facility, or if you're working in an advertising agency, measuring productivity is really, really slippery, and it really does depend on the specific industry and this specific company. But generally, what I would say is, most employees' productivity, it's not depending on the number of hours that you were sitting in a chair. It's task oriented, isn't it? And also group oriented. Someone at ATB, where I worked the other day, they recognize that they never work on a project alone anymore. We all work collaboratively. They
Wow.
couldn't remember the last time they worked entirely on a project by themselves. It is a much more collaborative industry, the banking industry where I work. So measuring productivity, I don't know if I have a great answer for that, but if it is a task-oriented set of expectations, I think managers can say, at the end of the month, or whenever there's a review, did you accomplish these tasks? If you accomplish them, I'm not really too concerned about when you accomplish them. You might have been sitting on a beach in Mexico. Well, not these days. You're not going to be doing that.
Yeah.
You might be sitting on your patio enjoying the sunshine, or you might be doing it at 2 a.m. when you have had a wave of creative thinking. As long as those tasks are being accomplished, I think employers need to say you've been productive and you've achieved what we expected of you.
Right. Thank you so much for the answer.
I just want to, before I go to the next question, let everybody know I'm recording this. So if you're frantically taking notes, I will put the recording up, upload it to my LinkedIn. Okay, Stephen Sandre. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce your last name. If you'd like to ask your question.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Very vaguely, faintly.
Okay, I'm going to try to talk a little louder. Is that
That's
better
okay.
right now? Okay, great.
Yeah.
Great. I think it's just a great point. I just guess the main thrust of it is I do wonder if there's a distinction between the aspect of work management that you talked about, whereby people can work from home and have more flexibility, which certainly is great. But you have to do also, I wonder if the reality of, if you look at our economy, at least 50% of the economy is based on, we'll call them old school physical industries.
Yeah.
As I gave some examples in my chat comment, manufacturing, mining, waste management, transportation. But there's physical interactions where someone has to do work. It's got to be passed to someone else who does work, and et cetera, et cetera. And how do you see that kind of physical structure or alignment being impacted by the aspect of creativity and innovation, and how that may alter the economy?
Yeah, it's an excellent point, and I'm glad you brought this up, because in some ways, it's easy for a lot of us, and my guess is most of us on this call who are able to work remotely. It's easy for us to think during the COVID days, everybody's working from home. In fact, the estimates that I've seen, it's only about 25% of Canadian workers have the ability to work remotely. The other 75%, to your point, you actually need to be on site. It's a construction job, it's manufacturing, it's food and accommodation. You can't just take your laptop home and get your work done. So it raises then a really great question about, what does creativity and innovation mean for workers who actually physically need to be on site? I think already we see, some applications in artificial intelligence, robotics, blockchain are transforming a lot of even those traditional industries where people have to be on site. And my guess is in another 10 to 20 years, we might see fewer and fewer people required to be on site, as more robotics will be taking some of those roles. So for companies and for employees in those industries where you at the moment still physically need to be on site, I think embracing the technologies, thinking creatively and innovatively about them, I think in some ways will replace or displace those traditional jobs. I think there'll be new jobs still in those industries. Here, a great example would be truck drivers. You can't, if you're a truck driver right now, you can't do that remotely from home. But as we expect to see more and more driverless vehicles and artificial intelligence, now industry or workers in the transportation industry, it won't be about driving a truck. It will be about writing system code, telling those trucks where to go and coordinating the logistics of moving goods from point A to point B. So I don't know if I'm answering that question very well, but I think even in those 75% of workers who can't work remotely, I think creative, innovative thinking around how to embrace those cyber technologies, that is where I think the challenge will be in the next 10 or 20 years.
Great, thank you.
Francois, if you'd like to ask your question.
Hello. Yes. So my question is relates a little bit that in many ways, as you just said now, I think it's exactly a good observation that 75% of jobs are not really in that creativity and value creating thing in the innovation economy at this point. And I think one of the problem we see, we work a lot with innovation district, and one of the things is a lot of cities or areas might not have the underlying ecosystem to move rapidly into that kind of knowledge economy, or this maybe not knowledge economy in the service, because service can also be knowledge, but more into this kind of innovation and value creation of new technology. And if the startup ecosystem is not very strong, so how does, like, for example, cities in Canada go from maybe not having so many of these technology leaders based there and driving this growth and this new value creation going forward?
So is the question really about how cities are designed, the physical aspects of the cities to accommodate more of these?
No, well, I mean, like, for example, in order to be leading, like, the Silicon Valley has been the kind of main example, but there's a lot of other places. Let's say compare countries or areas that are similar size, Sweden and let's say Eastern Canada. Eastern Canada has about 4 or 5 global companies, right? And Sweden has about 50, 60. Now, this ecosystem, and it's kind of old economy like Volvo and Ericsson to new one like Spotify. This kind of creates an ecosystem that makes it kind of very, there's a lot of new company bubbling up and so on. And how do we, because a lot of work is related to that, right? These are areas in the world where job would congregate and so on. So there's a bit of a geography of innovation also like that.
Well, this is a really interesting question, and one that I'm very interested in trying to understand or trying to solve this problem. Why does Canada not have as many global brands as you said, comparable countries like Sweden, which is, 1/4 the population of Canada. Sweden's about 10 million and Canada's about 37 million. A smaller country, even like Australia, which is about 26 million people. A lot of countries, smaller or comparable size to Canada, they have these big global brands. Why is Canada, why have we been unable in some ways to kind of break that code and have these global brands? Part of it, and there's probably a lot of reasons for it, but a lot of it I think has to do with our proximity to our big brother to the south, who we can't live with, we can't live without. If you are an innovative company in Canada and you come up with a really creative technology of some sort, chances are pretty good that somebody in Silicon Valley is going to wave a check for $5 million in your face, and you're likely to sell it. I don't think that happens as frequently with companies in Sweden or other places, simply because of the cultural proximity that we have, the physical and cultural proximity we have with the United States. So some of it, I think, is just, I don't want to use the word curse, but some of it is just the reality of living next door to the US. I do know that they also have this problem a little bit in New Zealand, where their best and brightest innovations get bought up by Australian companies. And it probably happens between Ireland and the United Kingdom as well. Although now with the Brexit, that may start to reverse. I don't know. I don't know if I'm answering your question very well, but I do think it's something that I wish we as Canadians would be able to figure out why we as a medium-sized global power have been unable to really punch above or even at our weight category when it comes to global brands.
Yeah, no, I agree on what you said. At the same time, just a few lines on this. I've been thinking about that, and I think the U.S. proximity is that it's a bit of an excuse because Sweden has the same problem with Germany and so on, but they see it more as an export market, and most of their innovative company cannot survive on the Swedish market or the Nordic market. It's too small. They need to be successful. You know, whether it's H&M, IKEA, they all broke through by being successful in Germany. And Canadians should be able to do the same thing. US is a huge market. Yeah. So there's a bit of, I don't know, it's a bit this, there's a maybe entrepreneurship or adoption of technology. You know, Canada and North America in general, we still have paper check. That doesn't exist in Europe anymore. You know, everything is you have to adopt technology very fast, right? And so there's a bit of mentality also, but at the same time, I think I was mainly thinking more at the kind of local level, like before, you know, Nortel was driving a lot of things. It disappeared. So everything that's—
Can I just jump in because I don't want us to get too far off track, if you don't mind, okay? I'm going to jump to Anne right now because she has a question related to community. If you want to ask your question, Anne.
Thanks, Deborah. Todd, very interesting discussion that we're having. Thank you very much for joining us today. When I think about the comment that you made about being in the fourth revolution and what that really means in the different parts of the revolution, and I think about community and working and the definition of the work community, how will working from home change that definition or impact community as we go forward into the next 10 years or so?
Plus, you had a question specifically around Wi-Fi.
No, that was work from home, Deb, not Wi-Fi.
Working in the community, how will Wi-Fi impact the work community?
How will work from home, WFH?
Right, so, okay.
Yeah, lots of, also a great question. I think as workers, both the ones who can work from home, but also the ones that have to work on site, as workers become more demanding of flexibility, I think this is where community and community engagement is more important. So I'm thinking of even things like, I mentioned this in my presentation, but caring for aging parents. For the last year, I've been making this point that I think taking leave from your work, just like you would normally for a maternity or paternity leave, taking some time away and stepping away from work in order to care for aging parents, I think is going to become more important and a greater expectation by employees. I think the COVID crisis, I mean, just look what's happened in our system of long-term care. And I don't want to get into that debate too much, but even before COVID, I don't think there was a single Canadian in any province who was entirely thrilled with the system of long-term care that we provide. I think that community is going to step up and provide more of that. And it might be the case that maybe 5 or 6 or 7 families band together, they're in a similar situation, and they are going to they're going to tie their life rafts together, they're going to form community in order to care for aging parents. In whatever arrangement that looks like, I don't know. But I think that's one example. Another example might be how, in fact, we are engaged in community around food production and food security. Things like community gardens. I think people will start to pay more attention to those kinds of things. I know it's not always, you know, we live in an inhospitable country when it comes to gardening, but there's still a lot of things you can do. I think economic crises, unemployment, strains on household incomes is going to force people to maybe rediscover, okay, how can maybe as a community we grow and prepare our own food. it's just one example. I don't want to make us sound like we're going back to the Amish days, because that's not really what I'm intending. But I think that community will become more important. I think as a result, employees are going to have a greater expectation around flexibility, even those who work from home or don't work from home, that they need to step away from their office or from their position wherever they're at in order to engage in those community involvements.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. I think now as we move forward, we're now in the reset of business and what business is going to look like, and community and social behavior is going to look like as we move forward out of COVID. And you brought up some good points about what we should be thinking of, not only as it relates to how we work, but when do we work?
Yeah.
What does that look like?
Yeah.
Actually, I'd like to take a segue of your question and to call on Lupita. No, I'm sorry, not Lupita, Karen, and then Lupita. Karen, because you have a results-only work environment, which I think is relevant.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of talk of, when, and I think it's Kaplan, I think is her last name, published her book about results-only work environments. And there was a lot of talk about that. At the same time, there's a lot of talk about, how you give yourself mind time for innovation. Results-only work environments are not easy to set up, but, in a post-COVID world, with all of the factors around the gig economy, do you think we'll start to see a little bit more resurgence around, does it really matter what days you either take off, you're in the office, not in the office, the schedule you keep, as long as, if this is my project, here's my results, can I now move on to the next thing and pay me for that project? So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that as well, Todd.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of industries, again, we have to be careful that we don't think about every Canadian being able to do this, because, as we said, 75% of us still can't. But more and more industries, the company I work for, ATB Financial, 2.5 years ago, we rolled out what we called Workplace 2.0. And it was all around equipping our team members with the technology that they need to work when and where it works for them. Understanding that, they might not be productive at a certain point in the weekday, or they might have obligations around community, around family care, around child care, whatever it's going to be. But there is still an expectation you're going to get this project done when it makes sense for you. And I think a lot of us have gotten used to using this term work-life balance. I like more the term work-life integration, because work-life balance sort of implies that, when I'm working, I'm not living my life. And when I'm living my life, I'm not working. And I think we need to think about it as integrating. Certainly, you can't allow your laptop and your projects at work to dominate your life. And that, no one is suggesting that. But, being able to integrate your work and your life together, I think that is the way we need to think about it. I'm kind of rambling on with an answer there. I don't know if I've answered the question.
Okay. That's okay. I was just looking for a little perspective, because I agree. It's not, you can't apply it to everything.
No.
But taken, some of the concepts, I think, from it might be useful as we think about how we shape work in the future. Yeah. So no, thank you.
Lupita, this is a good time for you to come in with your question.
Yes, and thanks, Todd, for the presentation. And actually, I think you already answered my question with your thoughts. I was going to ask you about how do you see the work-life balance concept being redefined post-COVID, or what other thoughts you have around it, because many companies are using that as a way of branding their employee value proposition. And it looks like, as you're saying, everything is going to be merged and mixed.
Yeah, and I think more and more companies will figure out ways to do this. I think in some ways the pendulum during COVID might swing so far because we're being forced to work remotely. My guess is that after the COVID days finally end, a lot of us are going to run back to our offices and if not physically embrace our coworkers, we might at least be very happy to see them and to have some water cooler chat, and maybe in some cases happy to be done homeschooling for now. There'll be lots of, I think, adjustments the other way. But as we move into the post-COVID world, I also think people will understand, hey, you know what? I love being at the office, but on those mornings where there is a storm bearing down and it's going to take me 2 hours to get to work, or I have a refrigerator being delivered sometime between the hours of 1 p.m. and 6 p.m., you know, you never know. I am going to take advantage of the technology that I got used to using during the COVID days. And I'm going to figure out flexible ways of both being present in an office, but also being able to work remotely when that makes sense. I don't think it needs to be one or the other. And I think companies and individuals will find what works for them.
Yeah, thank you.
John, you have a question? It's a good question.
Yes, thank you. So I'm curious about what your views are, or what kind of information there is out there on further enabling the majority of Canadians to be able to access high-speed internet. You know, I work for a company that does operate mines across Canada, and you know, when I'm in Toronto working from here, I can reach anywhere in the world in a moment. But when I go 20 minutes outside of Halifax to one of our properties, I can't get a cell signal, let alone high-speed internet to run the human resources information systems, et cetera, that I need to run. So it seems to me that as a company, or sorry, as a country, our framework to support success as we move into the fourth industrial revolution isn't complete. So what kind of opportunity or threat does that provide to us?
Well, yeah, it's a great point. Bigger threat, I think, for those areas, especially in rural Canada, northern Canada, that do not have access to high-speed internet. The 5G network that is rolling out. This is the electrical revolution of 1900. So I can imagine maybe some people in 1910 feeling like rural Canada, there's not electrical power distribution to all of, maybe that was more the 20s, I don't know. But fast forward to 2020, this is the conversation we're having. And for those regions, those rural communities that do not have access to it, it's going to be a serious impediment for them. And I guess it's up to, maybe provincial governments, maybe federal, I don't know, to figure out ways, how do we make sure that every Canadian has access to high-speed internet? It's sort of like the, where was I driving through rural Alberta, and I saw an old motel, and it still had this old sign on it that was advertising phones in every room and color TV. And I thought, boy, that sign needs updating. But probably around 1960, a phone in every room or a color TV, this was revolutionary. Today, a hotel, if it doesn't have free Wi-Fi, no one is staying. Like, it might as well not have plumbing, right?
Right.
Wi-Fi is an expectation just as much as running water or a toilet that flushes for hotels. And I think for industrial development, rural Alberta or rural Canada, those expectations around 5G high-speed internet networks are going to be the same thing.
Yeah, it's almost like the next phase of infrastructure projects, those nation-building projects that we've had in the past that needs to happen.
Just like paved roads or electricity.
Yeah.
Or color TVs.
We have so many questions, and I want to make sure we don't run out of time. So if people could just ask the question and not do a long commentary maybe. So Angela, if you could go.
Hi, Todd.
Hi.
I'm just interested in hearing your thoughts around mergers and acquisitions post-COVID as companies position themselves for future.
Yeah. When you first said it, I thought you said murders, but mergers and acquisition, that's different than murder. Well, I guess it depends on the industry. So here I can be a bit Calgary-centric. Our energy sector is absolutely in crisis mode. You're going to see an enormous amount of mergers and acquisitions, more acquisitions, as Canada's energy industry kind of works its way through this catastrophe of price. There's going to be a lot of really good deals for the stronger players. They're going to be able to pick up assets on pennies on the dollar. But unfortunately, that will mean a much smaller, in terms of the number of firms, a smaller energy industry going forward. Other industries I'm maybe not quite as familiar with, but I think every industry, with the exception of maybe the technology industries, well, the public sector is not really industry, but I can't think of too many industries right now that aren't under some sort of crisis mode. And I think that is going to pose for the stronger, more creative, more innovative players some really great opportunities for picking up some assets.
We're going to change gears slightly with Paulette's question.
Mute. Oh, there. I had to find how to take myself mute. It's a little bit of a different thought, but you got me thinking, Todd, when you were talking about community and other things that are going to become important to people, like elder care. And that got me thinking, oh boy, is society in for another wave of systemic bias against women? And I'm making a very presumptive leap here that the majority of women will be the elder carers in a family or in a work group. I'm just, as an HR community, I'm thinking, yikes, that's something that I'm going to have to be on the watch for, because certainly it's kind of a given with childcare, but now elder care.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation. I confess I hadn't thought about it in that way, but I think you're certainly smart in thinking about, we need to be careful that it doesn't become a gender expectation thing.
Yeah.
We don't have childcare going back hundreds of years, there was sort of that precedent that traditionally it was. So we're always fighting that stereotype today in the 21st century that in fact parenting needs to be both parents, whatever gender they are. Going forward with elder care, we don't have quite as much. Well, I'd have to think about that. I don't know if we have quite as much of a precedent, a stereotype that it's always women caring for them. Maybe we do. I don't know. But I think it's an interesting point, and one that we should be more aware of or cognizant of, that we just don't somehow default to think that it's going to be females that are expected to provide care for our elderly.
Right. Or if it's seen as a double whammy. Geez, we just went through this with you, with your children,
Yeah. Well, maybe we can even look at it as, okay, women did disproportionately more of the child rearing. So guys, you're going to take care of the aging parents and somehow balance it that way. I don't know.
I want what you're smoking.
I mean, that might be a bit of a utopic sort of thought, but
yeah,
it's a good thing to keep in mind. Yeah, it's good to keep top of mind for sure.
Let me move to Greg with your question.
Hi, Todd. I was wondering if you could elaborate on your first cause about accelerating cyber technologies. I know the things you mentioned, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, they were slowly being adopted, but what is it about COVID that is accelerating it? Is it just the fact that there's such economic hardships that companies are going to be forced to take on these productivity improving tools, or is there something else that's driving it?
Well, I think some of it is cost, and by the way, this isn't going to happen, I don't think, in 2020 or 2021, because a lot of companies are going to be in survival mode. They're not going to be rolling out a lot of capital on robots. At least not, I don't think they will. But going forward, I think some of it will be cost saving, but some of it will be how we communicate. So being able to communicate more remotely, being able to do more video calls. I know a lot of companies right now, the reason they're hesitant to do a lot of these video calls is still around security. because not a lot of these, are as secure as ones would hope. That's why meeting in person in a boardroom, you can shut the door, you've got security. But so technologies like blockchain, which is all really about enhancing security, I think that might provide some new options that up until now they haven't really had to think about a whole lot. So to answer your question, I think some of it will be around cost, but some of it will be around we need to figure out new ways to communicate with each other in a world that is feeling a bit insecure around physical contact. How do we do that in ways that that technology can still instill trust in us?
Thank you.
Celine, your question?
So I'm really curious about, lots of companies, big companies, small companies have brick and mortar for everybody being able to go to work. And I was just curious what your thoughts are on, what will, if the future is working more from home or from wherever you want, what does that do to commercial real estate, potentially even personal real estate? Like, more houses will likely need office space, things like even space design in work environments, buildings themselves. I mean, I would imagine that most companies have long-term leases, and to suddenly have, hundreds of employees working from home, on the one hand, it's great because you have distance, but on the other hand, how do you, get out of those leases, and what will that do to our downtowns and our, all of that space?
Yeah, it's a really interesting area to think about. What does downtown Canada look like in 10 years or 20 years? I think we will reimagine what an office building is all about. I know Calgary right now, Toronto is in a much different situation, but Calgary, we've got a lot of office towers, but about a third of them are empty, or about a third of the space is empty right now. And it's not going to get filled up anytime soon as people, companies are laying off, companies are vanishing. And to your point, more and more people might decide to work remotely. But I think it's an opportunity for us to rethink what housing looks like, how we integrate maybe with housing more community interaction, more intergenerational living, more working space within the house for actually doing your income work as opposed to your community work or your family work. Because the houses we've built, mostly in Canada, with few exceptions, but they're all designed for one generation. They're designed so that a couple can generally, I mean, not every couple, but you move in, you rear some children, and the children, when they're 18 or 20, they flee away, and then they start the process again. Now we're not seeing that. We're seeing children living at home for much longer periods of time for all sorts of different reasons. And the reason why sometimes there's conflict in this is because the house was not designed for multi-generations. And getting back to the aging parents or the elderly, care, when parents have to move in with their children, oftentimes it's out of necessity, but the house isn't designed for this. People try to do the best they can with a mother-in-law suite, maybe converting the garage into, a one-unit apartment for their aging parents. But ultimately, that garage was not designed to do that. We're doing the best we can. But I think there will be I hope we see a resurgence in the way we design our residential communities to accommodate more community, more intergenerational living arrangements, whatever that might look like. North America, we're the only ones that really don't do this with intergenerational living. Every other culture around the world, you look at them, and they are living quite happily with multi-generations in the same, if not under the same roof, within the same proximity. And also then to integrate, how do we think about working spaces within our homes so that we're not having to use a spare bedroom, which was designed to be a spare bedroom, not an office. But we're figuring out ways to do this, but I think we can be even more clever about it. And post-crisis world might spur on some really creative thoughts around that.
Okay, thank you. It's just 2, and I know that Todd has other things to do. Todd, can
Actually, I don't.
You don't? So if anybody,
I've had a busy morning, but I got my 2 dogs are looking at me.
Oh, that's so good. Okay, well, then I have a question for you.
Yeah.
There was a discussion the other day that I caught, I think on CBC, where the thought is, wouldn't it make more sense for government to stop investing so much in transit that goes to the hinterlands and instead invest in bringing people closer into the city and building affordable housing?
Well, that is an explosive topic of debate. It depends if you live in the 416 or the 905, I suppose, to use your Ontario area codes. Yeah, it's a huge debate. I don't know how it's going to settle out either. I think in some ways these long commuting times might become a bit old-fashioned. Maybe we're still building. I know we have this debate in Calgary right now because pre-COVID, I mean, everything's up in the air now, but there was this desire to build a light rail transit line way up in, that would connect the north end of Calgary with the south end. And while we're way behind on some of that infrastructure in Calgary, some people are questioning, are we building a transit system for the 20th century? Should this have been in place in 1980 when it really would have made more sense? Does it make as much sense in 2020? And will it make any sense in 2060? We don't really know the answers to that. But I think it's an interesting debate to have. I'm not a transportation economist, but I know it's not unanimous.
Because they were talking about Vancouver actually, and I wondered if you had a thought. So any questions for Todd? Anybody? They've been.
And I should say, like, people probably do have other things. If people need to drop off the line and get on with their day, or if they're just tired of staring at a video, we can end the call. But if anyone else wants to hang out and keep chatting, I really am happy staying on for a few more minutes, and because I love all this conversation and I love these topics. So
one question I have for you is, what advice would you give to HR leaders based on your big 3 takeaways, your predictions?
Oh, what advice? Well, here I'm on dangerous ground because I'm not an HR professional. So, anything I might say presupposes I'm an expert on the topic, and I'm not. But it's the same advice I guess I give to young people coming out of school. It's the same advice I'm giving to senior leaders and in banks and energy companies. More than ever, it's all around flexibility and adaptability. How quickly are we able to pivot? And being able to not completely forget everything that we've learned, but in a way unlearn it and be prepared to relearn new ways of thinking. I know as an economist, the biggest challenge I've had over the last, I would say, 3 years is unlearning all of the economic dogma that I was taught in the 1980s and the 90s. Which wasn't wrong at the time, but what it is today, it's incomplete and it's insufficient to explain the economy of the 21st century. So I don't want to say we forget everything, but we have to realize that everything that we've learned in the past is a shadow of the knowledge that we're going to need taking us into the future. Are we able to pivot and adapt rather than just hold on to the old ways of thinking? That's the best advice I think I could give to anybody.
Yeah. Any HR folks want to weigh in on this? Feel free. Yeah.
Yeah, Deb, I do. Thank you, Todd. That's a good segue into, I'm not so sure that, so how do HR leaders communicate to leadership teams about what they need to do going forward and what they need to learn? Because it is relearning some skills and how they're going to run a business given remote workforce, given perhaps no brick and mortar, given a number of different circumstances. And what do we as HR leaders need to be thinking about to start that conversation with the leadership teams?
My guess is that it would maybe start with the, and this has come up already in the conversation, what's your level of trust of your employees? Because supervising employees, you know, it presupposes we don't trust you for a second. And the minute we turn our back on you, we don't trust you that you're going to do any, you're going to be, you know, wasting time or on Netflix or, you know, YouTube. I think it has to start with the trust. What is your level of trust with your employees? And if there's no trust there, that might be the problem you first of all need to address. And if you can get to the point of mutual trust, then can you start to rethink working arrangements, when, where, and how works best for the employees. It only works under an environment where that trust is there. So maybe, and again, I'm talking about an industry that I'm not a specialist in, but maybe HR, that's where it needs to start with the senior leadership teams is, do you trust anyone that works in your company? Yes or no? And if the answer is no, then we need a rethink of, you know, why'd you hire them in the first place?
Well, I think the other thing about that is about trusting your employees means that you're going to trust that they're going to be productive at home, and you're going to have to change the way you manage that performance or measure that performance and productivity in meeting their goals and objectives for the year. And that's going to change as well.
Yeah. And this COVID crisis has forced everybody. And again, when we say everyone, we're still talking about that 25% that can work remotely. But it's forced companies to let go of that and say, we don't have any choice. They're working at home. We have to figure out a way to, you know, monitor productivity and making sure that projects are getting done and the quality is there. But it's forcing them to do it.
Thank you.
Todd, I'm curious what you're hearing from the leaders that you're talking to right now. What are their challenges and concerns?
Well, a lot of the, you know, in the last 6 weeks through this COVID crisis, a lot of the leaders I've been talking to are here in Alberta. And, you know, we are in a different, I shouldn't even laugh because it is going to be absolutely terrible. But the leadership here in the energy sector, the forward-looking ones, they want to engage in this conversation. How do we take advantage of this crisis to reposition the energy future or the energy industry of the future and not just get back to the past? Not everyone is there yet. And no one tweet this out, but I don't know if our premier in Alberta is there yet. There's still a lot of opinion that we just need to get back to how we used to do it. The COVID crisis, I think, is exposing the stupidity in that, I think. And that maybe is another reason for some optimism or a glimmer of good news, is that this COVID crisis is laying bare this myth that we just need to get back. We just need to build pipelines, and we just need to get oil back to, you know, $70 a barrel, and we just need to replace the prime minister, and everything goes back to how it. Guys, this, you know, those aren't the problems. So the COVID crisis, so to your question, the leaders I'm talking to right now in Calgary, that's what they're focused on. And the forward-looking ones, and I think there's a lot of them, are saying, all right, the gig is up in this province, guys and girls. We need to figure out, what does the energy industry of the future look like, and how can we position Calgary and Canada to be that leader? The climate change debate has already been moving us in that direction. It's time to solidly take our heads out of the sands, the ones, maybe the oil sands, I don't know, the ones who still had it in the sand, and look to the future of the hydrocarbon industry. Because I think there is a future for it, but it cannot just get back to how we used to do it.
And is there a lot of talk? I guess the talk also has to center around the employment situation then too, right?
Absolutely. And I think that is why, at least in the immediate, you know, present, that's why there has been a call for, you know, Ottawa, give us $30 billion so that we don't have to lay off everybody from these companies, so that we can, you know, keep them on doing something. I still don't know if that's the best. I mean, $30 billion in backstops and lines of credit. I get why that would solve an immediate problem, but that doesn't solve sort of that solves the immediate, but it doesn't solve the medium term problem, like the next 2 years. Because if you're really just propping up insolvent companies, 2 years from now, they're still going to be insolvent, and that $30 billion wouldn't have done anything. So is there a way that if there is some financial assistance from Ottawa, that it not just be for loan guarantees, but that it actually is around transforming the energy industry into something new?
Yeah, very good. Anybody else? Okay. I think either people are shy. I know that they have questions, but they might be shy, Todd. So why don't we wrap it up here? I really want to thank you. It was fantastic. It was more than I imagined. This was great.
Well, thank you so much, Deborah, for reaching out to me. The minute I saw your email, I was excited because it was so great to reconnect with you. And I knew whatever ask you were going to have was going to be something fun and interesting. And it was. So I enjoyed this very much.
And if people want to reach out to you, Todd, how can they do that? I know I put your website. Is that the best thing that people can do?
The website, toddhirsh.com, is the very best way to reach out to me. I mean, you can check out a couple of the books that are online, or if you want to see if you'd be able to have me come as a speaker in some way. Website is the best way to do that.
So this has been the greatest audition of all time. You know that Todd is a fantastic speaker. So anybody who's looking for a speaker, I would really encourage you to connect with Todd. He's
and I'm very much looking forward to the end of COVID days when I can come back to Toronto. I always love being in that city, a great part of our country. So looking forward to when I get to reunite with a lot of you in person.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks so much. And I want to remind everybody that next Wednesday, we're on at 3 o'clock. I've got Dr. Gina DiGiulio, who is the medical director of MedCan, who's going to talk about mental health. Because that's a big thing because this is going to go on for a while. So I think we need to look at that. So Todd, thank you. I mean, honestly.
Stay well, everybody.
Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for attending. Thanks.
Thank you, Todd. Bye.
Thanks, Todd. Thanks, Deborah.
Thank you, Deb.
Thank you, Todd.
Bye.
Thank you, Deb. Bye.
Thank you.
Take care all.